hit record. Okay.
Oh.
All right.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Greg Daddis, a professor of history at SDSU. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to give you a couple minutes just to let some potentially late folks sign in, and then we'll start in a few minutes. Thank you.
I see people are. It would be good to see what they're seeing, yes? That's great. Our audience is actually able to see us.
Yes, we'll give it about one more minute. We'll get started. Thank you.
Yeah, I think people are just getting in, so.
Okay, why don't we get started? I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Greg Daddis. I'm the professor of history and the USS Midway Chair in Modern U.S. Military History at San Diego State University. And it's really my pleasure to be part of this panel today, reflecting on the legacies of September 11, 2001, as we are just days away from the 20th anniversary. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for what I'm absolutely certain will be an engaging and thought-provoking conversation from an incredibly talented and diverse panel of just amazing folks. So from my perspective as a historian, for many Americans, I think when you ask them what the events on September 11, 2001 mean, it's likely that images of the World Trade Center in New York City would immediately come to their minds. I think that these falling twin towers have become embedded in Americans' cultural memory, a constructed narrative, if you will, of a new era in many Americans' thinking that was brought upon the United States by evildoers who somehow hated everything that America supposedly stood for: freedom, democracy, a liberal world order. And yet the meaning of these images, even iconic ones, have a tendency, I think, to change over time. And certainly how we react to events, especially traumatic ones, also go into altering the meanings of these images. And in the process, I would argue, create new images and new legacies. And so if we reflect on 9/11, not just on the day itself, but the history and the inheritances that followed, I think we can see how its meaning has been contested, not just here in the United States, but overseas as well. And I think this is something that we'd like to explore this afternoon. Now, I want to note here that none of us who are part of this conversation that will follow, none of this conversation is intended to dishonor or disrespect. We all understand that many innocent people lost their lives on 9/11, and most certainly in the years that followed. But it seemed important for us to consider the legacies and responses to that day over the last 20 or so years. And indeed, much of the meaning has been derived from America's response to 9/11, with its clearly, I would argue, militarized focus and many of the questions that followed from America's response to 9/11. What did 9/11 mean for the expansion or contraction of democracy, both at home and abroad? How did it influence how Americans saw themselves on the global stage? And how did others see the United States as a global war against terrorism was unfolding across much of the globe? What did words like freedom and democracy mean as US military interventions sprawled across wide regions of the world map? And so in many ways, I would argue 9/11 was presented by US political leaders and many public commentators as a major disjuncture in American history. But was it? Was the day refashioned instead as an opportunity to push certain policy agendas that actually had been with us for a very long time? And so these are some of the questions we wanted to explore today as we near the 20th anniversary of September 11, 2001. And anniversaries, as I'm sure most of us know, are often appropriate times to reflect on the past. And we have two programs here at SDSU that seem well placed to host such an event. As director of the Center for War and Society here at SDSU, our aim is to provide a forum for our faculty members and students and Southern California community leaders and hopefully national policymakers to engage with vital questions on war as a human phenomenon. And Latha Varadarajan, who heads our university's multidisciplinary international security and conflict resolution program, which is a mouthful in and of itself, but we call it ISCOR, is designed to address changes in the nature and meaning of national and international security, peace, and conflict resolution. So Latha and I are both delighted to be co-hosting today's events, which bring together three activists of different types who are not only experts in their field, in politics and human rights and military affairs, but who have been important voices in helping us all understand the meaning of 9/11 over the last 20 years. So it's now my distinct pleasure to introduce our panelists before I turn it over to our session's moderator, Latha. I want to note here that at any time during the conversation, you can share your questions in the Q&A box, and I'll moderate the Q&A session after the panel concludes its remarks. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. First is Najla Ayoubi, who is the Chief of Coalition and Global Programs at Every Woman Treaty. She is also a lawyer and a former judge. She served as a legal advisor for the State Ministry of Parliamentary Affairs of Afghanistan and played an immense role in the constitution-making process of Afghanistan. She was the senior state attorney at the Attorney General Office of Afghanistan, state attorney of the Parwan province, and judge at the Parwan Provincial Court. Ms. Ayoubi has 2 MA degrees, one on law and politics from the State University of Tajikistan, and another on post-war recovery and development studies from York University of the United Kingdom. She's also the former deputy representative of the Asian Foundation Afghanistan office. I'd also like to introduce my very, very good friend, Danny Sjursen, who is a retired US Army officer, the director of the Eisenhower Media Network, a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, and contributing editor at antiwar.com. Danny also co-hosts the podcast Fortress on a Hill, which is a great resource, which I highly recommend. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the LA Times, The Nation, and many, many other publications. And he has served combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan and taught history at West Point. He's the author of 3 books, including Ghost Riders of Baghdad, Soldiers and Civilians, and the Myth of the Surge, Patriotic Descent, America in the Age of Endless Wars, and most recently, A True History of the United States. And finally, to round out our panel is Bill Van Auken, who is the Latin American editor of the World Socialist website and a member of the National Committee of the Social Equality Party in the United States. Bill has written and lectured on the history of the Trotskyite movement in Latin America and has written extensively on that topic, and has written also on the operations of US imperialism, not just in Latin America, but around the world. And finally, my co-host and colleague, Latha, is a professor of political science at SDSU and the director, as I mentioned before, of International Security and Conflict Resolution program here. She joined the SDSU faculty after receiving a PhD in political science from the University of Minnesota in January of 2005, and her published work has focused on the politics of transnationalism, the meaning and relevance of post-colonial struggles, and the debates surrounding the contemporary manifestations of imperialism. She's currently working on a book project that brings together her background in international law and international relations to discuss the contemporary development of a legal humanitarian world order. So folks, you can just see from these bios that I think you're in for a treat today. I'm so excited to be joined by these amazing activists in their field. And Latha, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. I hope you all can hear us as well as see us. Please feel free to let us know on the chat if there are some technical issues. It is really a pleasure to be here today and to have with us this wonderful panel of speakers with such diverse experiences. We would have very much liked to host you in person, but of course, given that the world is in this grip of an ongoing pandemic, this seemed to be the best possible way to bring to our students and our broader community an expertise that really matters more than ever today. It's almost 20 years to the day that 9/11 changed the world that we are living in, and a majority of our students on this campus have come of age in a world that has been defined by that day. So once again, it really is a great pleasure to have you all here. The structure of our conversation is going to be very simple. We have, Greg and I, come up with a set of questions that we would like to ask all three of you. And we would like to pretend that we are sitting around a table and go around the table. And as I ask the question, perhaps each of you could take maybe 3 to 4 minutes to answer it. And of course, we welcome you to talk to each other as well. And once we are done with our questions, we'd like to open it up to a broader Q&A session that Greg will take over. So that's how we're going to start. So given that you all have such diverse professional backgrounds, not to mention political trajectories, I have no doubt that that influenced your reaction to what happened on September 11, 2001. I was curious, perhaps maybe we could start this conversation by you telling us and our audience a little bit about how did you understand that attack and what happened to the United States that particular day and the initial response as it unfolded. And at that moment, what was it that you remember worrying most about the future? So perhaps, Najla, we could start with you and go to Danny and to Anne as I see you on my screen. So,
yeah, thank you so much. Pleasure being here also. Thank you. Yeah, it was. I was in Afghanistan under the rule of Taliban that time when 9/11 happened, and we had no access to TV, and I don't have those images from the first day, but we had a radio that we were hiding the radios and secretly listening to radios. And I heard from the radio, from the Deutsche Welle, even I remember the radio, that how many people lost their lives and how many people injured. And it was like, and then I was following through the Voice of America, BBC, World News, and all of this. And it was, I could feel to my bones that losing a beloved ones and people in your life, and also witnessing what is really happening. I was feeling to my bones all of the pain, because I have lost my brother and my father. Both of them were assassinated, and what you're looking at the future is kind of like you feel darkness, you feel helpless, because we were on the dark time. I was in the dark time already, and then listening that it's also happening to the free world is also another piece. Later, when the United States decided to come to Afghanistan, for me, I was really looking at how the airstrike happened in Afghanistan and how the Taliban were using the civilians' houses as a shelter, fighting against the United States. This was also another piece of nightmares that we have seen, because this is really attached to the 9/11. And also 9/11 probably is, for some people, as you mentioned earlier, I'm not disrespecting anybody, and I'm not, but out of some of the tragic situation, there are good stuff is also happening. For me, it was for the United States people, not probably, for sure, it was the darkest day. And for the people who survived, it was, and for the people who lost their beloved ones, was a dark day. But even no one believed that after the United States came to Afghanistan, attached to the 9/11, it brought me as a human and as a woman freedom. So it was a dark day for some people, but it was a freedom for me. It brought me a liberty. It brought me, just hope in future. Uh, do I respect the people who lost their lives, unfortunately, because of this tragic incident? But it's still, for me, it was the situation. And at the same time, I could also see on the other angle of it and other aspects of it, how the Islamophobia increased, how people were targeted in the United States, how people were Muslim community and Muslim people would start being targeted in the United States and also out of the United States. So this is like, there is a kind of positive and negative aspects to it. That's why this was my feeling, and I didn't want to see the world to become more kind of more violent, but it brought lots of worry about it, and unfortunately we have seen it in the past 20 years.
Yes, well, thank you already for sort of reminding us of the complex and very complicated legacies that seem to be apparent almost immediately and bringing in these very different feelings. Danny?
Well, I'm almost embarrassed at my response to 9/11. So I grew up in New York City, but not really. Staten Island. So I grew up in the firefighter and police capital of New York City. And so my family was in it. They were in it. I mean, my grandfather was a firefighter. My uncles were firefighters, my cousins. But I was already at West Point, where Greg, one of our hosts, had gone. I believe he was a graduate in 88 or 89. I was at West Point. First person in my family to go to college, and it was West Point. And I was in boxing class. Maybe Colonel Daddis can tell us, but West Point has to be one of the only places that still has a mandatory pugilism class, right? But I was in plead boxing, and sure enough, someone ran into the room and said, there's a plane crash in the towers, but it was very real. I was a military sort. I had just turned 18. I think my biggest fear, to answer the question, was that the war would end and I wouldn't get in it. That the war would end and I wouldn't get in it. Because the truth is, I guess I was hoping for a war, but I had grown up in the 1990s when the Gulf War was the standard, which, by the way, Colonel Daddis, I believe, may have been in, and it was a 100-hour ground war. And so I thought I'd miss it, but instead it's still going. Right. There was no way to know that. So I was a mix of revenge, toxic masculinity, frankly, where it was, I joined to prove how tough I could be, and here's my chance, right? Here's my chance. I don't like any of this, by the way. I don't like the way that I sound when I describe, this time, but I'm being honest, and it was very hard. What I will say is we were professionals. We were professional soldiers. This wasn't a draft. We all volunteered for the military. We all volunteered for West Point. And I think there was a certain sense of duty to it. I mean, if I could put some sort of positive on the spin on it. And so I think I was very connected to the war. And so I can talk about it later, but 10 years later, I was in Afghanistan and I was a company commander in charge of 100 soldiers, and they sent a Reuters reporter to talk to me about 9/11. And we can talk about this later, and I probably will, but it was very different 10 years later. And so I think at the time for me, it was vengeance. It was masculinity, it was none of the things that the Bush administration had told me. What I mean by that is I probably was a vaguely Republican fellow, right? But the stuff that they were saying was not what motivated me. What motivated me was more of a visceral sense of this was my city, this was my family. My uncle Marty was killed, Marty Egan Jr. on 9/11. So I got to, go get vengeance. But I think that I'm embarrassed of a lot of that, but I think it's important to raise because I think that a lot of white male Americans felt that way. And probably it's important to talk about.
No, thank you, Danny, for bringing it up. I think for those of us who were alive and seeing that go down, and I certainly don't count myself as a white male American, and I can't say toxic masculinity has been one of my problems, but I do understand that, and I think it's very important. So I really appreciate you sharing these feelings. And I mean, I remember watching it on TV, and I was nowhere close to New York City. We were in the Midwest. But so Van, where were you, and what would you like to share with us about your response?
Well, like Danny, I'm a New Yorker, and September 2001, I was working as a reporter for a New York City newspaper, and one of my main beats was the city fire department. So on September 11th, I made my way to the World Trade Center after the planes had struck the towers. And I spent a lot of my time in the following weeks reporting on recovery efforts, covering funerals and memorials, interviewing firefighters who made it out of the towers, as well as some of the loved ones of those who didn't, covering firefighters' demonstrations, which at times turned violent in their opposition to the way Giuliani was handling the recovery. All these experiences to me seem like yesterday, and it's really hard to grasp that it was 20 years ago, and that presumably some of our listeners today, the participants, weren't born when it happened. That some of the soldiers who were killed in Afghanistan last month were only born that year. And I think for a lot of people, the feelings of grief and anger over what was really a terrible tragedy and a horrible crime are still very raw, those who went through it. That being said, I am a socialist and a Marxist, and I understood then and I understood now that you cannot base your response to such an event on emotions, much less let your emotions be manipulated to serve the agendas of those in power. Now, the World Socialist website, which is the online publication of the International Committee of the Fourth International and the US, the Socialist Equality Party, of which I'm a member, posted a statement on September 12th, which summed up our response to the attacks. And if I could be permitted, I'd like to quote briefly from it. It began with the following. It said, the World Socialist website unequivocally condemns the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Those responsible for the hijacking of 4 commercial passenger aircraft and their conversion into flying bombs are guilty of mass murder. Nothing of a socially progressive character will be achieved on the basis of such an indiscriminate and callous destruction of human life. It continued, nevertheless, our condemnation of Tuesday's terrorist outrages does not in the slightest imply any lessening of our principled and irreconcilable opposition to the policies of the US government. Anyone who wishes to understand the why and wherefore of yesterday's events must study the historical and political record of the US and the Middle East, especially over the last 30 years. The unrelenting efforts of American imperialism to secure its domination over the oil resources of the region has placed the United States in violent opposition to the legitimate and irrepressible democratic, national, and social aspirations of the Arab masses. It went on to warn that in the face of the drumbeat for war, the quote, escalation of US militarism abroad will inevitably be accompanied by intensified attacks on democratic rights at home. And finally, the statement concluded, it is the policies pursued by the United States, driven by the strategic and financial interests of the ruling elite, which laid the foundations for the nightmare that unfolded on Tuesday. The actions now being contemplated by the Bush administration, indicated by the president's threat to make, quote, no distinction between terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them, close quote, will only set the stage for further catastrophes. Now, clearly our statement was running counter, to a wave of propaganda, a wave of, confusion, outrage, which is, not informed by politics. But I think the warning has been thoroughly and really brutally confirmed over the past 2 decades, and indeed over the past month. I don't think we have much to retract from it. As for the second part of the question, as to what at the time I worried about the most, I would have to say, in the first instance, it was the well-being of my family, my friends, my colleagues in New York City. New York was paralyzed. The mass transit was shut down. I couldn't figure out how my daughter was going to get home from school. Telephone lines weren't working, cell phones weren't working. But as the scope of the attacks and the official reaction became clear, my overriding concern was the prospect of new and terrible wars abroad and a wave of political repression at home. Unfortunately, I think that's what happened.
Well, thank you, all three of you. I really appreciate your ability to connect your personal, immediate response to these broader political questions. And in a sense, you're already sort of telling us what I'm going to ask you next. I know that each of you, have followed very distinct trajectory as activists, and also in sort of how you have been involved in analyzing and commenting on the past 20 years. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, there seemed to be, at least among the ruling elite, as Van pointed out, a bipartisan consensus about what the nature of the response ought to be. The authorization for the use of military force was passed almost unanimously by the Congress and Senate, and it set the stage for a subsequent series of responses by the United States. And I was hoping you'd take a few minutes, maybe each of you, to tell us how you think the response of the United States actually shaped the world. And what do you think was its effect on American domestic politics, on the perceived role of the military, and actually the life of the Afghan people, which was very much in question? So I know that's a lot, but if you could succinctly answer all of this in like just 3 minutes, that would be wonderful. Najla?
Okay, sure, definitely. Thank you. Yes, I think 9/11 brought, it had lots of negative consequences and also positive, the response particularly. First of all, it was a very loud wake-up call for the Americans and for the world, actually, that the terrorists exist and they do whatever they want to do. That's one. Second, emotionally, as you mentioned already, that emotionally it brought the people of United States together, and also outside of the United States. They brought out people from outside to have just to be together. And also the parties, they left their all politics behind or aside, and they responded to this. And as well as around the policies, I mean, legislation and policies globally and nationally, it had brought lots of specific legislation perspectives to the response as well. And also on the negative side of it, it also has divided people. How divided? Because of the on the racism part of it, the Islamophobia, religion, so many aspects become also negative as part of it. And also it increased the weapon industry. Unfortunately, the weapon industry, they made a lot of money. And as well, another aspect is also that it created a vacuum and a gap that anytime the United States or any other government wanted to just go somewhere and do something, this is a very big excuse for them to go and then, I'm not saying intervene or whatever you call it. And exactly this happened to the terrorist group as well, because they were also equally brought themselves up to this stage that now they are even getting to the power. In the 20th of anniversary of the 9/11, we see the Taliban in the power, the most with the most atrocities that they are atrocity acts that they are doing. And also, I think another aspect that I wanted to make sure that I am the impact on Afghan people. Like, as I mentioned earlier, this was a liberty for me. I could go back to work. I could go freely walk to the street. I could work. I could go for my education. I was a free person. It made me free, not only me, but thousands and millions of Afghans. That's one aspect. It brought lots of development. We did a very, not only on the, as you already mentioned, part of we brought lots of things onto the table, part of the state building, reconstruction of the country, development of the country, bringing the youth in the gaps that between education, we had a gap that we had to close those gaps, and working hard and becoming, like, after 20 years, the boy or the girls they born that year, they are now highly educated girls and highly educated boys. So now we are also bringing how that impacted our life. And at the same time, it's also at the global level, it brought the impact was on the global terrorism, anti-terrorism policies, and also brought lots of changes on the immigration, because we have seen lots of immigration policies suppressing immigration and suppressing asylum seekers. Was also laws and policies were developed not only in the United States but elsewhere also. Policies for among Muslim communities. It has changed the Muslim community basically feeling in style of life, because they now brought more fear into the hearts of the Muslim communities. On Afghanistan, again, I wanted to just make sure again, mentioning that unfortunately, this was a liberty 20 years ago. And today is a dark day again for me and for my people. How this brought an impact and affected my life in the people of Afghanistan.
Thank you so much, Najla. Yeah, I can hear that pain. So thank you for sharing that. Danny? If Danny's here. I think this is the beauty. Hi, there you are, Danny.
The thing about, after 9/11, I thought I knew what we were about as a country. I mean, I was very sure. I was a plebe at West Point, which is a freshman. Greg knows that term, and we were worried that we would miss the war. That's what we wanted to do. We wanted to fight. And then I went to Iraq. I went to Iraq. I didn't go to Afghanistan. One would think that if 9/11 had been ostensibly, planned in Afghanistan, that's where we would go. But I didn't go there. And I will tell you, I was class 2005 at West Point, which was the class of 9/11. We had 911 graduates. By the way, I still think West Point orchestrated that. And I feel like Colonel Daddis knows they're capable of it, right? Like, they probably let one person graduate who shouldn't, or kept one in, right? But we were that, right? We were that. Well, I'll tell you, this is true. I've done like a vague estimate. About 800 of my classmates went to Iraq first. 800. Class 2005. Class of 9/11. Cover of Time magazine about it. About 800 of us went to Iraq. I met classmates at the Baghdad International Airport. We called it BIOP back then. Greg knows. My friend Cecil Wolverton, who had played rugby at West Point, he was an animal. Like, he was one of these guys that partied hard, and he was a big guy. Had been wounded with a grenade, and I saw him at BIOP. We were going on leave together. And it really never struck me, what are we doing here? In other words, why are we in Iraq? Like, why is that where we are rather than Afghanistan? Now, I don't believe in the President Obama narrative of like Afghanistan's the good war and Iraq is the bad war. I think my point is this, like, in answer to the question in a more general sense, like, how do we respond to 9/11, right? Willy-nilly, I think, is part of the answer. Angry, uncomfortable, scared. I know this. I know the AUMF, the authorization for the military, use of military force, it passed on the House on September 14th.
Yep. Yeah.
Ground Zero was smoldering. I went to Ground Zero with my uncle Stephen, who identified his best friend, Captain Marty Egan, who had died on 9/11. Identified him by the, the tattoo on his arm. They're best friends, I used to call him Uncle Marty, right? He wasn't, but we thought that. He took me there on Columbus Day weekend, early October of 2001. And it was still the smell. It was still right? And America made a decision to go to war weeks before. And I think that's what kind of really stuck with me. And in a certain sense, at the time, by the way, like, to give grace to the American people, to give an understanding to what we were all doing, maybe to give grace to myself. I don't think we really realized it at the time, but when I look back, I say, a country should not make decisions about war when the crime scene is still smoldering. And I think that was like sort of my lesson from that time. And it really raised a lot of questions later. And I'll admit, at the time when I should have known, I didn't know. And I don't know if that is a description of my own sins or maybe a bit of grace for the American people in general, but either way, it's how I felt at the time.
It takes a lot of grace and courage to say that, Danny. So, Van?
Well, I think the first thing you have to ask is whether the war on terror and everything it entailed was a response to the 9/11 attacks, or did the attacks provide US imperialism with a welcome pretext for carrying out wars that had already been long in preparation? I mean, we were told over and over again, 9/11 has changed everything. I mean, this catchphrase really served to deny that the attacks or the response to them had anything to do with what had come before. But for at least a decade before 9/11, the United States had embarked on what had become an increasingly aggressive militarist policy. Really, one could say beginning with the Reagan administration, or even before, really in the years directly before. At the end of the 1970s, the Carter administration and its national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, adopted a policy which they described as drawing the Soviet Union into what they said would be their own Vietnam, or a Vietnam-style quagmire in Afghanistan. And they mounted what would become a $40 billion program to arm and support Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan and to draw them in from all over the Middle East. It was the biggest operation ever mounted by the CIA, and that's saying something. That US intervention ultimately led, of course, to the Soviet invasion, a brutal war, and then a civil war that killed millions of people. The United States initiated that. Out of that came Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, who participated alongside the CIA in that operation and were well known to them. Out of it came the Taliban. And Washington at various points was working closely with all of them. Now, then you had, of course, in 1991, the Moscow Stalinist bureaucracy dissolved the Soviet Union. Then they proclaimed This was a unipolar moment, the end of history. And the conception was that there was no longer any impediment to Washington using what was unquestionably unchallenged military superiority to offset what had become a declining global economic hegemony and to reorder global politics. The main focus was establish US hegemony over the Eurasian landmass, as Brzezinski spelled out in that period. In particular, they sought control over the principal energy producing regions of the Persian Gulf and Central Asia. Now, of course, as well known, all of the officials, prominent officials of the incoming Bush administration, that George W. Bush in 2001, were advocates of finishing the job that Bush Sr. had started with the first Persian Gulf War, that is, invade Iraq, overthrow Saddam Hussein. As for Afghanistan, US interests centered largely around those of the major oil companies. They wanted to establish an oil pipeline from the Caspian Basin, one of the biggest reserves of energy in the world, to Pakistan and the Arabian Sea. That would first serve to cut out Russia, cut out Iran, and provide the US with a lever to exert dominance over the oil-rich former Soviet republics of Central Asia, and to carry out, again, what was projected by US intelligence as an attempt to carve up what was left of the Soviet Union, to carve up Russia along ethnic lines. Now, in domestic politics, of course, the attacks also provided an opportunity to introduce far-reaching changes that involved massive attacks on democratic rights. You had Homeland Security created, the Patriot Act, the introduction of wholesale spying on the population, a massive increase in police powers of the state, including the militarization of local police departments. And the authorization of use of military force was mentioned that passed immediately after 9/11, as Danny said, while Ground Zero was still smoldering. But with it, Congress fully ceded power to the US president to launch wars at will without the slightest consent of the American people. Now, as for the lives of the Afghan people, obviously this had immense impact. But I think what was done in 20 years, beginning with the US invasion in 2001, the fact that 20 years later, the Taliban has taken even greater control of Afghanistan than it had when the US invaded, it's a damning indictment of what the United States did in that country over 20 years. Yeah. Clearly, masses of people were alienated by bombings, assassinations, night raids in a government which really lived off corruption.
Yes.
One can't understand how is it possible for a small, a backward Islamic fundamentalist, lightly armed militia to overcome the massive power of the United States and the Afghan forces that they created. I think this was obviously a failure after 20 years.
Well, thank you also for speaking to each other, because I think in a sense, the tragedy of the Afghan people and of Afghanistan is something that we should not lose sight of. I remember growing up at a time when Kabul was this gorgeous, beautiful land where people, used to go for vacation. When I try to describe it to my students, they think I'm speaking of a different world. And it is, as Van said, a damning indictment of what has happened, and the fact that wars were planned before the embers had been put down, and that's something worth thinking about. I do want to encourage our audience members, please keep your questions coming on our chat line, and my co-host Greg is keeping an eye out for it, so please bring it all, keep it going, so that by then, I promise you, I only have a couple more questions for our panelists, and we'll open it up to you. So do ask your questions. So I guess I would like you all to perhaps think about and maybe share with us a little bit about what you think have been the legacies of these past 20 years. You've already, each of you has hinted in your answers about that. So perhaps, talk a little bit about what you think have been the legacies of 9/11 for the American people, and for those living outside. How do you think these legacies have reshaped our world? Najla?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, actually, before going to that question, I'm also going to make a comment about what Greg mentioned, that, you know, I think this was the war in Afghanistan, or the 9/11 made the U.S. to have a longest war in the entire of its history, which is in Afghanistan. And also, this is not over yet. In my opinion, as an Afghan, I see that there are a very high chances of American may go back to Afghanistan. Again, because of all of these atrocities that are happening, and if the Taliban not keeping their commitment, they are not keeping their promises. And also at the same time, we don't know, because now this morning, this is very important. That's why I was thinking to mention this. I was talking to a lady, I'm going to be at their panel in Indonesia. She was talking about it and then said, okay, now people in Indonesia somehow trying, extremists basically, extremist group, that they are trying to kind of support the Taliban and somehow raise the flag of Taliban in Indonesia. So now you can see that we are putting a very bad example here, and making sure that, okay, the more you're violent, the more your acts are violent, you will gain, and we will sit with you on the table and we negotiate with you, right? So that's also another aspect of my perspective, that ISIS, Al-Qaeda may reform again, they may arise again along with the Taliban, and there is a big chance of the United States to go back. On the legacies, actually, the most important legacies for me as a human rights and women's rights defenders, and I think one piece of it already mentioned about the illegal detentions, unfortunately happen, human rights abuses, like even the detention was like private and public and private. Now we had, in Afghanistan, we had not only Afghan government detention center and prisons, but also American prisons and detention centers. And you can also see the Guantanamo. I'm not defending those, but it's still, you know, it also creates, we don't know what is really happening under those detention centers. That's one aspect. And also airstrike, because somebody have, like, we are living in a different culture. Somebody hates you, somebody have something, land disputes with you, and they're reporting, and then you just go and airstrike. You're just demolishing the whole family. And I think this is the one piece that is really make me very concerned for the future, and also the legacy of the that we are also putting these as example behind us, and there is no monitoring mechanisms to look at it, whether this was right or wrong, or a very transparent legal or evaluation or monitoring mechanisms. And also taking one piece, it's also another legacies that international communities also really looking into the terrorism and extremism in a totally different angle, because they were not ready, no one was ready for the 9/11. But now it's got, as I mentioned earlier, a wake-up call to everybody. Now everybody's putting their measures in place just to make sure that they are responding to it as well. And also for Americans, I'm sorry if I'm saying, but I have to say it because I can. Most of Americans living in the bubble. They think that whatever is beautiful and perfect in the United States, this is perfect outside of the United States borders, which is not. This is not the case. When you go to Afghanistan, Pakistan border, you see that what is really happening in those borders, which is not the same as border with the United States and with Mexico. So my point is that there are so many aspects to the human rights abuse of the human rights, and also other aspect to that 9/11, that maybe it may not be visible in the United States, but it is happening outside of the United States.
Yeah, thank you for talking about the visible and invisible aspects of these abuses and how important it is for us to actually understand them, both historically and in the current context, as Van was saying. So, Danny?
I mean, one of the things that most Americans don't realize is that the war on terror is not about us. It's not about the 7,000 something American soldiers that died. My son is named after 3 of them. I take it seriously. But the reality is, I mean, let's even broaden that. 7,000 American uniformed soldiers died. Maybe twice that died among contractors, mercenaries, to be clear. And 30,000 wounded and PTSD and suicide, all that. The United States started, perpetrated, and is continuing wars that have killed maybe 2 million foreigners. What does foreigners even mean, right? I mean, human beings is what I'm saying. Maybe 2 million, maybe 1 million. We don't know. The reason we don't know is we don't count. Go onto the Pentagon's website and they'll tell you exactly to the man or woman, mostly man, let's be clear about how they view it, how many people have died in these wars. They've got a number. Mm-hmm. Ask them how many people we killed overseas. Call them terrorists, call them insurgents. Mm-hmm. That's what I live with. What has really changed my view of the response to 9/11 is this question. It's an ethical question. It's a philosophical question. Did anything that I did make the world a better place? God, I wish the answer was yes. I do. But I'm a reading sort, right? Like I'm a thinking sort. And the answer to that question is obviously no. Everything America has done in the aftermath of 9/11, which I take seriously. You know, like I go on 5K runs from Marty, you know, from my cousin, uncle that wasn't either that died. But the answer to that question is no. I mean, nothing we've done has made the world a better place. In fact, at least 1 million people died behind that. I mean, the cost of war study at Brown, it was the most conservative, and they say we killed at least 338,000 civilians, direct or indirect. I was there for that in Iraq. I mean, I turned against the wars because I was a party to a civil war that my country started and I was a part of, and both sides attacked me. And that's the least important part, by the way. They attacked me. Like the most important part is that my country invaded a country illegally, started a sectarian civil war that didn't exist, and I had to pick up the bodies. And oh, by the way, I'm not the victim in that story. And I think that that's what did it for me, you know? And so when I think about the response to 9/11, it's penance almost. It's like, probably I was a sensitive sort that shouldn't have ever been in the army, you know? Like probably should have never went to West Point, but I think that the American culture, the militarized American culture gave me a platform. And they said this. They said that if you go to basic training, if you go to West Point, if you go to airborne school, whatever it is, right? Like the stuff that Colonel Daddis did, right? Before I ever did, and probably better. That gives you a platform. And like there's something to that. I don't believe in it, but I think that we have to use that platform to say, like, even the American military officer who did all that stuff has to be able to say that maybe the response to this was wrong. I've said recently that maybe the entire response to 9/11, what was wrong was that there was too many of me. There was too many machine guns. There was too many militarized responses, and what we really needed was a diplomatic and a social response, because here's what we know. Maybe that's wrong. Maybe I'm off. But what we know is definitely true is that whatever we tried with machine guns and West Point grads and guys with muscles and stout chests, all of that failed. Not only did it fail, it was actually wildly counterproductive, and it's demonstrably true. And so I think what I learned from that is maybe we need to rethink the way we respond to events, which might turn out to be black swans, which might turn out to be anomalies like 9/11, and say we ought to look at a less militarized response, if that makes sense.
Yes. With all due respect, Danny, I think we could do with more people like you thinking and actually thinking about the human costs of these kinds of wars. So Van.
Sorry, finding the mute button. I mean, on the legacies, I mean, obviously they're huge. I mean, what can one? I mean, I think it really has involved these wars and the lies told to wage them have discredited the White House. They discredited the Congress. They've discredited both the Democratic and Republican Party. The media, which basically retailed the lies, the academics who served as apologists for war, the financial elite that profited off of it. I mean, literally every institution of American society became implicated in crimes, chief among them waging wars of aggression. Now that was the chief charge leveled against the surviving leadership of the Third Reich at Nuremberg, waging wars of aggression. But the United States proclaimed its right to do so anywhere it chose. Now, all of this again, I mean, was the war in Afghanistan waged against Al Qaeda when Al Qaeda had been the American ally, and then Al Qaeda, we find, has become re-employed in Libya, in Syria, where they served as ground troops for U.S. regime change wars. It doesn't add up. In Iraq, it was weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein was going to give to Al Qaeda. Saddam Hussein, a secular nationalist, no prize certainly, but somebody who had no interest in arming Al Qaeda with anything. And yet, no one has been held accountable for what are arguably a series of war crimes. Now, in the United States, what are the legacies? I mean, democratic forms of rule have been increasingly hollowed out by state repression. You've got wholesale government spying. As others have mentioned, the promotion of xenophobia, Islamophobia, witch hunting of immigrants. And you add to that all of the other horrors, Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, torture, rendition. Guantanamo is still open, by the way, as they begin the 20-year-old trial once again. And then all the mass civilian casualties. And then on top of that, you have people in the White House who talk about, well, we took out that one, we took out that one, or the other one, as if there's some mafia bosses. In the end, I think what you have is a real brutalization of American society. I mean, these things abroad have an impact at home. And I believe they played a major role in laying the groundwork for the emergence of a figure like Donald Trump as the president of the United States, and even the attempted coup of January 6th. Now, obviously, the legacies are different for America than they are for countries that it invaded and bombed. After all, entire societies have been decimated. And as Danny said, millions have been killed, millions more wounded. I saw the figure, 5% of Afghan's population is disabled. I mean, it's unbelievable. And tens of millions turned into refugees. But I don't think we can just draw the line along national borders. I mean, America, there are people in America in a bubble, but the legacies of 9/11 are very different for the top 1% that rules the United States than they are for working people who make up the vast majority of the population. Since 2001 and beginning of the global war on terror, we've seen the fastest rise in social inequality in US history. It's reached levels that really were unknown since the end of the 19th century, the so-called Gilded Age. Wars produce immense profits for corporations, their shareholders. The government repeatedly bailed out Wall Street in 2009, again in 2020. Meanwhile, workers have faced declining real wages, unemployment, destruction of social benefits. And I think, these levels of inequality are also incompatible with democracy. And they're also, I think, producing a growing anger and militancy within the American working class on a level we haven't seen for many years. And workers' interests in the United States have a lot more in common with those of people in the Middle East or Asia than they have to do with those who rule this country. Now, the cost borne of war by Americans in terms of dead and wounded, lives shattered is by no means insignificant, but who bears it? The all-volunteer armed forces are drawn not from the children of billionaires and not many from the children of the wealthy upper middle class. I thought Biden's speech on August 30th announcing the end of the war in Afghanistan was quite revealing. I mean, he was responding to all the hysterical attacks over the debacle in Kabul, and he made a certain limited appeal to popular sentiment. He said, it's time to tell the truth to the American people. I mean, this was an admission that they've been fed nothing but lies for 20 years. He then went on to say, we've spent $300 million a day for 20 years. He said, the American people have to hear this, $300 million a day for 20 years just in Afghanistan. I mean, what could that money have achieved if it were used to better conditions of people's lives in the US and the rest of the world? And then he also spoke about, the cost of veterans, of these tribe veterans going through hell, of 18 veterans committing suicide a day. And these are staggering figures. Again, one has to ask, who has been held accountable for all of this, for this disaster? No one.
Those are great points. I think, thank you to all three of you for pointing out the human cost, the erosion of democratic norms, both within the United States and outside, and the emergence of these new kinds of divisions that are setting the stage for potentially even more dangerous trends to come. So in a sense, the legacy of 9/11 is still an unfolding saga. So that brings me to my final question. So I'm going to ask this of you to keep it just brief, because we have our audience dying to ask you their questions. So I guess after thinking about how we have come to this point, the question is, to use a phrase Van was probably more familiar with, what is to be done? What is the path ahead? So if there is one recommendation that you could talk about as what we need to do moving forward, that would be great. Just one recommendation from each of you before we move it to our audience. Najla?
Okay, thank you so much. I think we have increased and we have created the culture of impunity here attached to the 9/11. In my view, bringing the human rights abuses and also any other life cost attached to the 9/11, we have to bring those people to accountability. And meanwhile, we have to do our homework for the future to not happen similar, to not face the similar.
Thank you, Najla. Danny? Danny?
I think that ultimately,
Danny, you froze. Now I feel like we are hanging in suspense to hear what Danny has to recommend, because that might be the key to all the solutions. So as Danny works out his technical issues, and hopefully he can join us, maybe Van, can we turn to you for your one recommendation?
Well, I would just say, look, the era of the war on terror may be over, but war is not over. And I think the danger of war is only going to increase, and far more serious wars turn towards great power conflict. And I think my recommendation of what is to be done is there has to be a mass anti-war movement built based on the working class and linked to the struggle for socialism and united with workers all over the world. So that would be my recommendation.
That's a simple solution and simple recommendation. Thank you, Van. On that note, I turn it over to Greg. One of our, Danny obviously has some technical issues. As he rejoins us, Greg, I pass it on to you so that you can moderate the questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you. This was just a wonderful conversation. Thank you to everyone on the panel. This was just super insightful, and I really appreciate the conversation. For those of you who've raised your hand in the chat, just head over to the Q&A session and feel free to ask your questions there, and I can pick them up and ask. We'll go for about 10 minutes or so, if that's okay, and we'll look to end at about 5:15 Pacific time. So a question from Alex, which I think is interesting: Are we still living in the post 9/11 era, or will COVID, cyber fundamentally shift our conversation on national security away from its current hyper focus on the threat of terrorism? So I'll just open that up and just feel free for our panelists to jump on in.
I'll take the plunge.
All right.
I mean, you know, I get a sense in the observation, you know, there's been a wave now, obviously, the 20th anniversary. I think there's far more being said than was in the 10th, as I recall. And obviously the situation's changed. The debacle in Afghanistan has something to do with it. But it seems to me that there is a certain discussion of terrorism still. But as I said, I mean, if you read the Pentagon documents, they all say terrorism is not the enemy now. The enemy is great powers. The enemy is pure competitors. The enemy is China, fundamentally. So I would say that there's every possibility that terrorism could be utilized again as a pretext for war. But I think we have moved into a different era. I think the war on terror has truly come a cropper, as they say. It has been a debacle. There's no question about it. And I think it's going to be very hard to sell it to the American people that they have to go and fight again to roust out the evil ones in other countries. They've been through it once.
Thank you. Najla, anything on that, or?
Yeah, sure. I think I maybe have a different view on it because in the past 20 or maybe 30 years in my life, I have seen the history repeats itself. That's my comment.
Fair enough.
I have a specific question from Wahida for Najla. And you spoke about this earlier, and I think this is a really interesting question. Wahida suggests that it seems in Afghanistan that freedom was temporary. So was that worth it? And how do we come to some type of reconciliation with the temporary nature of freedom in Afghanistan as we're watching events unfold over the last few weeks?
So I think I would ask her how much how much her freedom cost for her, even if it's a minute. Freedom is freedom if it's a minute, or if it's a 20 years, or if it's a 10 years, if it's a temporary or a long-term freedom. For me, I think I know that we have paid a lot of price for what we have done in the past 20 years to have at least relatively peaceful society, that we were not a threat to the world and to the other nations. But now we still are a threat to other nations and to other people and to the freedom of people, even here in the United States. That's my point. I think it was worth it.
That's great. Thank you. I think for our next question, David's going to elevate us a little bit to geopolitics. He asked, does the fall of Afghanistan constitute a rejection of liberal democracy such that it could potentially influence other states to rally around the idea of illiberal states? And if so, why might that be? So does the fall of Afghanistan constitute a rejection of liberal democracy such that it could potentially influence other states to rally around the idea of illiberal states? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I would raise the question first. Are we talking about a liberal democracy in Afghanistan? I mean, I don't think there was one. I mean, I think you had a state in Afghanistan. I mean, the collapse, the rapidity of the collapse of the Afghan government indicates, I think, a lack of a real democracy, a lack of democratic roots, an alienation of the vast majority of the population from that government. So liberal, illiberal, I mean, I don't know. I mean, if we're talking about geopolitics, I think Afghanistan signals certainly a intensification of the conflict between the United States and China, which may also develop around Afghanistan. China has taken a very different attitude towards the Taliban than the United States. It's still waiting and seeing, but it has, I think, better prospects for, economic activity. It doesn't have the history, and the United States may well see, that as a threat. And China, has always said, you can't impose your system by force. And they see Afghanistan as vindication of that claim. But I think the conflicts will only increase, and I don't think it's necessarily between democracy and illiberal society, but it's between major power blocks.
And I think I would also comment that we also, as a global community, not only Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a very small country in a very, underdeveloped country, basically. But we all, as a international community, we have played a very significant role to bringing the country to this level. We are setting a very bad example, as I mentioned earlier, that we are negotiating with the extremist group, with the people that they don't understand, they don't even believe in the humanity, and even they don't believe in the human rights or even from any basic human rights. But we are sitting with them, negotiating with them, and also putting them, and that's why we are setting a bad example. That's why we are bringing more, exactly what you're saying, exactly. There might be potential other groups may arise, and then they will go and repeat again the same thing. So that's my point. And we have to take the responsibility, all of us.
Great, thank you. Why don't we do one final question? And this is from Michael, and I'd actually be interested to hear your thoughts on this. Earlier in 2021, General Miller, the commander of US forces in Afghanistan, predicted civil war may be on the horizon. Do you see this happening?
In the past few hours, a few days, and probably a week already, yes. There is a resistance, not only from the people who were involved, who were party to the conflict in the 40 years conflict in Afghanistan, but also the new generation of educated generation are also coming to the street, and they'll resist. So it means that I can see a very potential, unfortunately, a potential civil war in the country. Yes.
Thank you. Well, we're just about out of time. So on behalf of Latha, I want to thank our panelists. I'm sorry, Danny fell off, but Ben and Najla, this was just a fabulous conversation and so incredibly insightful. And, for me, I think it's important for us to think about not just the day itself on the 20th anniversary, but the responses that followed, and how many of those responses that as we saw during our conversation today, were fashioned as warlike, at the same time that there was this hope that something positive could come out of the chaos of 9/11, and why in some instances those hopes may have been dashed, and it's important for us then to think about on this upcoming anniversary, not just what happened on that day almost 20 years ago, but what followed. And I think for me, what we've seen here in our discussion today is how war is a very human phenomenon, with oftentimes lasting effects, that a search for security comes with costs. And as Latha mentioned more than once, and I think it's important to reinforce that those costs are human. And so I think that is important for us to reflect on as well. So I would ask you to think about this amazing conversation and think about how you can reflect on this anniversary, not just on what happened 20 years ago, but what has followed. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think the International Security and Conflict Resolution Program here at SDSU and our Center for War and Society are incredibly well suited to do just that, to think about the consequences of these oftentimes traumatic events and the ripple effects that last into the decades. So On behalf of Latha, I want to thank our two panelists for this just incredibly insightful conversation. And to all of you that tuned in today, thank you so much for coming. Be safe, have a wonderful upcoming weekend, and thank you so much for joining this conversation. Have a great day.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm just sad we can't applaud you in person, but we really appreciate all of you being here, and to all the audience member, despite this being a webinar. Thank you again to Van and Najla, and to Danny in absentia. So
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
yeah.